Okay. Okay, here we go. Right. Okay, it's going slowly. 1 second. Got it. Okay. Right, here we go. Okay, everyone got that?
Yes.
Great. Whoops, something weird has happened. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, so Iris, over to you.
Right. God reveals himself to Moses, employing the 4 expressions of redemption. Take out the children of Employing the 4 expressions of redemption, take out the children of Israel from Egypt, deliver them from their enslavement, redeem them, and acquire them as his own chosen people at Mount Sinai. He will then bring them to the land, he promised to the patriarchs as their eternal heritage. Moses and Aaron repeatedly come before Pharaoh to demand in the name of God, let my people go so that they may serve me in the wilderness. Pharaoh repeatedly refuses. Aaron's staff turns into a snake and swallows the magic sticks of the Egyptian sorcerers. God then sends a series of plagues upon the Egyptians. The waters of the Nile turn to blood. Swarms of frogs overrun the land. Lice infest all men and beasts. Hordes of wild animals invade the cities. A pestilence kills the domestic animals. Painful boils afflict the Egyptians. For the 7th plague, fire and ice combine to descend from the skies as a devastating hail. Still, the heart of Pharaoh was hardened, and he would not let the children of Israel go, as God had said to Moses.
Thank you. And of course, the last plagues are in next, etc. Okay. So we all know the story. Let my people go. Everyone knows the famous quote, let my people go. Question. When Moshe asked Pharaoh to let the people go, what exactly did he tell Pharaoh? I don't remember this. We'll have a look in a minute. But see if
didn't he say that let the people go to 3 days into the wilderness to sacrifice to me?
Yes.
Because we have to sacrifice animals that the Egyptian would find an abomination.
Yes. Question, is that true? Was that their intention?
Probably not.
Well, no, their intention was to leave, presumably. We know that, right? So this seems to be his opening gambit with Pharaoh is, we just want to go out in the desert for 3 days. But he's lying. So this is the question. How could he lie? Tell the truth. What have you got to be afraid of? God is on your side, right? We've touched on this before, like with Avram and Sarah. It seems rather strange that Pharaoh's going to anyway object. What difference if you ask him for a temporary reprieve or a permanent reprieve? Obviously, he doesn't want to lose his slaves, but the whole thing's about them leaving slavery. Not about them having a day out and then going back to prison. Also, surely you have to ask for what you want. If someone was in prison and you asked for them to be released for Xmas, and then they went back to prison, you said, wait a minute, why are they going back? So what do you mean? You only asked to be released for Xmas. So we're going to look at this issue of truth. It's a little bit challenging. So let's see the first source. This is what happens. This is what Moshe says. This is almost again, Iris, top of the class. What you quoted, you did this last week as well, almost verbatim. So you've obviously been reading the Parsha, which is great. So anyway, who else would like to read number 1?
I will.
Sorry, in the interest of today's world, we have to say everyone's really top of the class as well. So there we go. So no one feels right. Okay. Yeah.
Shall I read?
Yes, please.
Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Go sacrifice to your God here in the land." But Moses said, "That would not be right. The sacrifices we offer the Lord our God would be detestable to the Egyptians. And if we offer sacrifices that are detestable in their eyes, will they not stone us? We must take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God, as he commands us."
Right. So this is actually, this exchange is taking place after the 4th plague, the of the wild animals. Okay. So this is why Pharaoh says, "Go sacrifice to God." Right? He doesn't say that at the beginning because they previously asked to do it. So Pharaoh says, "Go sacrifice to God here," and they say, "No, it's not right. It would offend you. We have to go do it in the wilderness." So that's not quite true, is it? I mean, the offensive part is true. The Egyptians worship sheep, apparently, but the premise is not strictly true. This is after the 4th plague. Let's look at their initial opening gambit. This is what they said at the beginning, earlier. So that was chapter 8. This is chapter 5. Who'd like to read number 2?
I'll read that.
Jeff, go.
This is what the Lord, the God of Israel says. "Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord, that you should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Then they said, "The God of Hebrews has met with us. Now let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God, or he may strike us with plague or with the sword."
Right. So when Moshe comes to Pharaoh and says, "The Lord has said that we must go have a festival for him in the wilderness," Pharaoh says, "Why should I listen to him? I don't know him. I will not let Israel go." An interesting discussion, by the way. The exact phrase that Pharaoh uses is that he doesn't know Adonai. And there's different names of God. The name Adonai is they call it ineffable name, the Yud Hey Vav Hey, that represents the esoteric dimension of God. And then we have God as Elohim. And Elohim means like a judge. Can also mean judges or strong people. So when we talk about God as Elohim, we're usually talking about the God who operates through nature, that you can understand. You may or may not believe in him, but you can understand there's a God and he operates through nature, and that's why it sometimes rains and sometimes it's sunny and sometimes things happen and so on. The God that's sort of above nature and has control over the whole world in the way that we talk about is something that's alien to Pharaoh, but Pharaoh understands the concept that you have certain forces of nature that may be because he has his own gods. So if you actually look at the Hebrew, it's interesting. So they explain that Pharaoh is not saying, "I don't understand the concept of a being." He has a very limited perception of that being, though, as just being sort of, the sun and the moon and the weather and so on, but not some, which is why he has to be shown all these miraculous plagues. But just in case you thought this is Moshe getting the wrong end of the stick, let's just see what Hashem himself says to him. Right, who'd like to read number 3?
I'll read it if you like.
Go on, please.
"You and the elders of Israel will then go to the king of Egypt. You must tell him, 'The Lord God of the Hebrews revealed himself to us. Now we request that you allow us to take a 3-day journey into the desert to sacrifice to the Lord our God.'"
Right. So
So in effect, God is telling Moses to tell lies to Pharaoh.
he's giving him a strategy, yes. And the strategy is ask for a 3-day holiday. And in reality, right, you're going to, I don't know if it's happened in recent years. I remember years ago, it used to be a problem for Cuba when they sent teams to the Olympics and things, because quite often they would defect and not come back, right? It was a good opportunity to escape, basically. So now question, do you have to be honest with someone like Pharaoh, an oppressor? I mean, it seems like a slightly bizarre question. Are you allowed to lie to save a life? You're allowed to lie to a wicked person? Do you have to be honest? Like, it's like, I don't know.
To be honest, though,
It's like when
Rabbi,
I was in school, there was a famous story of, I think it was an Israeli guy who got into a fight with one of the English kids, and basically he punched him in the mouth while he was taking his jacket off. Like, you take your jacket off to fight. What's going on here? Well, you have rules of how to be a wicked person. Sorry, go on, Iris. You're going to say, yeah.
I was just going to say, he doesn't actually tell Pharaoh, or God doesn't actually tell Moses to say, after our festival, we'll come back. He just says, allow us to take a 3-day journey into the desert to sacrifice. He doesn't say, and then we'll come back.
Right, he doesn't say they'll come back, right? I think it's kind of implicit, but you're right. He's not entirely, it's possibly an error of omission rather than commission.
Yes, it's a lie by omission.
Right, we find that in other places as well.
Jacob being blessed.
Yeah, when Jacob comes to his father, he doesn't exactly say, he says, I am, comma, Esau is your firstborn, but he forgets the comma, right? I am Esau, your firstborn. We all know what he's trying to do, but it's plausible deniability. You can say later on, Moshe could say, I never said we were coming back, just asked for a 3-day break in the desert. You assumed we were coming back. Right, there is a relevance to this because Pharaoh presumably doesn't want to lose his slaves, but he might be quite happy to give him a 3-day break. He might. This, by the way, would explain, we haven't yet had the hardening of the heart, right? That happens later on, towards the end of the plagues. This would explain why, initially, yes, he doesn't even want to let them go at all, but at the end, he lets them go. And then he basically has a change of heart, right? He says, what have we done? Why would we have a change of heart? Because he realizes they're not coming back. Maybe he saw they had all their possessions with them. Let's see what Pharaoh says after they start escaping finally, right? So number 4, who would like to read? Deborah, Beryl, do you want to read?
I'll read.
Go on.
The king of Egypt received news that the people were escaping. Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds regarding the people and said, what have we done? How could we have released Israel from doing our work?
Right, so it seems Pharaoh's issue is not they're having a 3-day break, it's that he realizes he's going to lose his slaves, right? That's why you have to read the small print in the contract. So, 1 second. Something is not quite right here. I mean, actually, at one point, Pharaoh says they have a whole discussion about who's going to go. Is it going to be the people or the livestock or who's going to go into the desert? And at no point do they talk about the promised land. Why doesn't he just come out with it? So you might say,
well, because Pharaoh's obviously not going to say, yes, you can go, you can all go, you can take everything that you want and leave us forever. Pharaoh's not going to go with that at all, by any stretch of the imagination. But he might just possibly accept them going off for a little while and coming back, and he might be gullible enough to think that they will come back.
But then we know the whole story. The whole story is that God says, I'm going to show the Egyptians my might and they'll learn a lesson. He does all these plagues.
But he doesn't know that.
All that just for a long weekend, for a 3-day holiday? Really? You know? If
that's why I say Pharaoh
right.
might have been gullible.
You're right. So if this was a negotiation to get an extra 3 days holiday, it might make sense, right? And if you decided to quit, there was a big thing with a lot of people that, people were furloughed that basically ended up being made redundant at the end of the period. The only reason they weren't made redundant earlier was because the government was paying their salaries. So that was a bit of an abuse of the system. But, it's, if you're asking for a 3-day holiday, that's great. But if you actually basically want to quit, then just quit. Don't take your 3-day holiday, quit. If this was a sort of, so it's interesting. It's the nature versus supernatural. So in the natural order of things, it would make sense to go in to negotiate with a realistic, achievable goal, right? That would make sense. start with, we want a 3-day break to go out to the wilderness. Right? Once you get that, then you'll be able to escape. But start with that, because he's more likely to give in. Since we're told the whole thing about God showing his might and power to the Egyptians, then surely actually the higher you aim, the better. Right? I want my people to have a 3-day holiday, and if not, God's going to bring plagues to you. I want my people to leave Egypt, which, remember, they said no slave had ever escaped from Egypt. Right? This is a much bigger deal. So when you've got God on your side, it's fine. But maybe not. You might be right. Let's see what the commentaries say, because they definitely discuss this. I was thinking, just by the way, it's a bit like, it's interesting. There's, a lot of companies might be giving bonuses, let's say, around Xmas time, because of cost of living. So on the one hand, that's good. On the other hand, there's a very, very specific reason they're giving a bonus rather than the pay rise. Because a bonus is a one-off and it's not a commitment to a higher salary, whereas a pay rise obviously then becomes index linked. So, Mr. Mick Lynch and his lot, they're asking for a pay rise. I think that you would find that if they got a 3-day bonus instead, most of them wouldn't be happy. But anyway, I'm not sure that's a good analogy, actually. Right, let's see what the commentaries say. Who's got good eyesight?
I'll do it.
Right, go on, Julian. So we've got 4 different commentators here. You just want to say each one. You don't have to say their dates if you don't want to.
Okay,
yeah.
Rabbi Shmuel David Luzzatto. It was impossible for Moses to tell the truth to a tyrant like Pharaoh.
Right, simple as that. You're dealing with a Meshuggah. You have to, it's not the time to be chivalrous, basically, right? You have to say what you've got to say in order to survive, okay?
Rabbi Yaakov Mecklenburg. Technically, Moses did not tell a lie. He did indeed mean that he wanted the people to be free to make a journey to worship God. And he never said explicitly that they would return. That's what we were talking about.
Right, so that's an interesting one, right? So he says, please free the people so they can go out in the desert and worship me. That wasn't untrue. They were going to go and worship God. The only difference is they weren't going to come back. Right. The only problem with that is we know that Pharaoh would have a very different view if he knew they weren't going to return, right?
Yeah.
Okay, next.
The Abarbanel, God told Moses deliberately to make a small request to demonstrate Pharaoh's cruelty and indifference to his slaves. All they were asking was for a brief respite from their labors to offer sacrifices to God. If he refused this, he was indeed a tyrant.
So it's kind of like we said, you're asking for something small and attainable, and even that he won't give you. So obviously won't give you the bigger thing.
But who was that to demonstrate to? Because if it was to demonstrate to all of the Israelites, well, they knew that he was a cruel tyrant.
Good question. Possibly it was to set him up for the plagues. That if he would turn around and say, why is God bringing these plagues to me? Say, because you refused our request.
Maybe, yeah.
All we're asking for is a 3-day long weekend. Is that too much to ask? We work so hard, kind of thing, I think. Good question. Who was it proving it to? I mean, people presumably knew he was
slaves that weren't Jews.
Sorry?
Might be to other slaves that weren't Jews.
True. Or to the Egyptian people, they should know what kind of a leader they have. Unfortunately, that doesn't usually help. When you have a despot, people usually know that they're pretty mad, but they usually still manage somehow to hang on to power. I mean, do the Russian people really feel that Putin is looking after their interests? I don't know. Okay, and the final one, ignore the plus sign. I don't know how it got in there.
Rab Elchanan Samet. This war between Pharaoh and the Jewish people, I don't know how to say that.
This was
don't worry about the
this
plus.
war, and in war it is permitted, indeed sometimes necessary, to deceive. So
Right,
yeah, that
so
was the
basically-
justification that you were saying before.
Yeah, all's fair in love and war, basically. No, not all's fair. Anything goes. Okay. Right, so they definitely deal with the question. Okay, so just to summarize again, we've got Rabbi Luzzatto says, look, when you're dealing with a tyrant, you have to do whatever it takes, basically, which is similar to the last answer, right? The second one says that he didn't technically lie. The third one says that it's basically a strategy, a negotiating ploy. I'll ask you a question. Is this a new phenomenon? Have we come across this before? We just quoted about Yaakov and Esav, yes? Right? There's a few of these things.
About lying, you mean?
Yeah.
Telling
There's
about saying they're sisters and not the wife of
yeah, I mean
Abraham.
Abraham did that twice.
Right.
Yes, and David, didn't David do that as well?
And
So
Tamar
Pretend
and
mad.
actually loads of people, isn't it?
Hmm.
Right. Yes. So Avram, we had and Yitzhak, right, with Sarah twice and with Rivka, that they
Yes.
basically told white lies. Let's look at some of the other examples. Yaakov, when he's leaving, well, Lavan, of course, right? When he tricked Yaakov with the
Marrying Leah.
yeah.
Yeah.
So when they
And Rachel, when she was sitting down and said she couldn't
Yes.
get up.
yes, yes, right. A good example, actually. That's a few of the ones that we've got here, I'll give you on the slides. So
Abraham breaking the idols in his father's shop.
Oh,
yeah,
that's
we
a
have all these.
Oh,
so
yeah.
these are
He said they did
Well-
it themselves.
yes. Are you allowed to lie to illustrate someone's stupidity? Good question, right? Yeah, absolutely. Right. So let's I didn't even think of that. So let's see a few examples. Right. This is Lavan after they sneak away. Right. Who'd like to be Lavan? Iris, you want to read?
Okay. How could you do this? You went behind my back and led my daughters away like prisoners of war. Why did you have to leave so secretly? You went behind my back and told me nothing.
Right, I missed the previous verse. That's verse 26, verse 20 of that chapter. It says Yaakov decided to go behind Lavan's back and didn't tell him he was leaving. Right, and the end result was he chased him and he accused him of, right? Here's another one. When Yaakov and Esav meet up, this is what he says. Who'd like to read number 7?
I'll read that. You know that the children are weak, and I have responsibility for the nursing sheep and cattle. If they are driven hard for even one day, all the sheep will die. Please go ahead of me, my lord.
Yeah, you had no
Right.
intention of going.
So it wasn't strictly a lie. I mean, you have to look after your sheep and so on. But Esav said, let's travel together. And for whatever reason, Yaakov gave a diplomatic excuse. Right? I've got a headache or whatever. And a slightly more serious one, right, is of course what happens after Dinah's raped. What does Shimon and Levi do?
Oh yes, they go and they say that it's not fair, that it's not right that their daughter, their sister should marry uncircumcised man, and all the men of and that the other women in their group should also, the same should not happen to them, and so that all the men in the village, in the town, should be circumcised. And then while the men are all suffering after their circumcision, they go and kill them all.
Right. And the Torah actually says quite clearly here, Jacob's sons answered Shechem and his father, Hamor, speaking with guile, with deceit, because he had defiled their sister Dinah. The exact translation is Bemirma, with Yaakov is referred to as a Ramai, a cheat, right? A sneaky guy, basically, a wily fox. So that we find quite a lot of examples of this being economical with the truth, actually. So how do we reconcile this with the Torah of truth and the importance of truth?
The message, you do what you need to.
Quite possibly, yes. If you look at all these examples, one thing they have in common is usually they're not an outright lie. It's usually creating a false impression, which is not right. But what are you supposed to do when you're dealing with people who are less than honest themselves? Avram said, I told you she was my sister because I was afraid you'd kill me otherwise. Okay, listen, for the choice of telling a small lie or getting killed, I would say you tell a small lie. It's an interesting question. I don't remember the answer, actually. It's a famous question, which is brought in a book called Responsa from the Holocaust. Probably quoted before, it was written by Rabbi Ephraim Moshri, who was the Rav of the Kovno ghetto, and later years relocated to the United States. The question was, if somebody could get basically a fake baptism certificate with their name on that would say, Yankel Goldstein was baptized into the church and accepted the Holy Covenant, whatever it is, in, 1937, right, with a date, which is complete nonsense, complete fabrication, but might save your life if you found yourself face to face with an SS officer and you could claim that you were baptized, they might let you off. Right, it's just a piece of paper. Are you allowed to do that? You're obviously not allowed to convert to another religion. The person has to give up their life rather than renounce Judaism. But is that renouncing Judaism? Or is it just a forgery?
It's saving a life.
Okay, but you're not allowed to serve idolatry to save a life, right? If
You're not necessarily going to serve.
Right, it's a technicality, isn't it? It's a little white lie sort of thing. So I don't remember what the outcome of that discussion was. It's the sort of thing that most people instinctively don't want to do anyway. But I think it might have been that it was permitted because it doesn't mean anything. It's just a piece of paper. It's a piece of paper that does the job of what you need right now. On the other hand, it's the sort of thing people don't feel comfortable with. Right, it's the famous Protestant bee story. Remember the Protestant bee story? I'm sure we've discussed this recently. It's a bit of an urban legend, I think. I'm not sure if it ever took place, but this is wrong on so many levels. But when the US Army was going into Saudi Arabia, particularly, I think, more than Kuwait, possibly Kuwait also, a concern was raised about the safety of Jewish soldiers, right? These are not countries that have, now they're getting better, some of them, but they're not countries that have a history of great love for Jews. What would happen if a Jewish soldier were to be captured or somehow end up behind, in a compromising situation? So there was a suggestion that rather than having, I think it was actually a Bubba Meiser, but anyway, it was reported there was a suggestion that rather than putting Jewish on their dog tag, it would say, whatever, Jonathan Goldstein, which sounds silly, but anyway, Protestant B. And Protestant B, there's no such thing as Protestant B. Protestant B would be basically code for a Jew. Anyway, the way the story went was that none of them did this, and they all insist on having Jewish written on their IDs and whatever. I don't know if that's true or not. I think that if you're fighting a war somewhere where people are at risk, then you turn around and say, we can't, so we're not coming to your country, in the same way that I believe they had various restrictions on the observance of Xmas and on female soldiers, etc. Turn around and say, if you want us to come and help you, we do it on our terms. But anyway, that's a different discussion. We learning in the mornings, we're doing halachas of Rechilus. Rechilus is kind of Lashon Hora, but it's more telling tales. And we said about, are you allowed to tell a little white lie? So for example, someone says, I heard that someone was going around saying that they didn't like my work and it's harming my business. Do you know who it is? And you do know who it is. Are you allowed to lie and say, sorry, I have no idea? Or somebody says, what did that guy say about me again? And you say, I don't remember, when you do remember quite clearly, but you don't want to stir the pot. So you are allowed to stretch the truth and bend the truth for a greater good. We don't like it. It's good to tell the truth, but you are allowed to stretch the truth and bend the truth for the greater good.
Can I go back to the previous point a moment, please?
Yes.
Jeff, when you were in the services,
Yeah.
did it say Jew anywhere on your documentation?
Yes.
It did. Okay.
Because basically, if anything happens to you, they have to know which minister to get, isn't it? Basically,
Yes.
What it comes down to.
Okay.
It's only going to be relevant if, unfortunately, you're killed and no one knows who you are. If you're alive,
Yeah.
you can tell people.
So it's on your dog tag and things.
That's right.
Yeah. No, I just wondered if we did the same as the Americans.
So yeah. So we actually, this happens quite a lot. Right, are you allowed to? I mean, there's other examples as well. There's the famous Gemara, right? I think we've learned this before, actually, probably in a similar context, right? The song comes from the Gemara where it says, how do we dance before a bride? What do we do? What should we say? And Hillel says, you say, what a beautiful glowing bride. And Shammai says, how can you do that? You tell the truth. If she's pretty, you say she's pretty. And if not, you say she's a good cook and she's very homely. And then Hillel says, you should still say she's beautiful. Shammai says, how can you lie? He says, you're not lying. She's beautiful to her chassan. So, oh, what a beautiful bride you have. Yes, because she's beautiful to you. But also the question is, are you allowed to lie? To make someone happy, What are you your friend says, come meet my bride. She's the most beautiful girl in the world. And to you, she looks very strange. What are you going to say? She's not beautiful. Say, it's wonderful that you found each other. It's not lying necessarily. First of all, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So in some ways, it's a bad example. But, a lot of things are subjective. Do you like my painting I did? Wow, it's really impressive. It might not be my personal cup of tea, but, it's subjective. Sometimes something's really awful and you have to say that sounds really awful. Sometimes you're not doing someone any favors. All the people that tell their friend that their dress looks lovely and then they go out and it looks ridiculous and then they go embarrass themselves. That's a whole different story. But you are allowed to stretch the truth. Often, when, like in these examples, when you're stretching the truth, you can make the case for, it's not really untrue. You look really lovely in that dress. Well, you look lovely in everything because you're my wife. So I would always say that. It's not a lie necessarily. If someone says, "Tell me truthfully, does it flatter me?" No, sometimes people don't really want the truth. That's the other thing. People say they want to hear the truth, but they don't. But truth is definitely a value, being honest and being truthful and having integrity. But we do see the crucial point about all these situations is there was usually often, not always, I wouldn't say it for the birthright, but in most of the other examples, there was some danger. Right? Yaakov leaving Lavan, Yaakov and Esav going together. Right? Shimon and Levi couldn't use the excuse of danger, by the way. Right? Avram and Yitzhak with their wives could use the excuse of danger. I think the ones that stand out as not, Moshe can certainly use the excuse of danger. I think the ones that stand out as not being times of danger would be the taking the birthright and actually Shimon and Levi. They had the upper hand. No one was declaring war on them. But anyway, that's so what do all these things have in common? Well, one thing they have in common is it's times of danger. It's times when we're powerless. We're often having to use our wits to survive. And even then, sometimes you have to create a false impression, but you still should be mindful that you don't really want to lie. You prefer not to lie. I mean, this might be an interesting precedent for people who say, about how you deal with authority and is it okay for a school to lie to Ofsted and slightly say, yeah, we teach about all different kinds of families, when what they really mean is we teach about Ashkenazi and Sephardi and Israeli and Hasidic families, not gay and lesbian and transgender families. But the way they say it gives the inspector the impression that, so some people would say, how can you be dishonest? But actually, we have this throughout history. I know, I'm just saying, right? People might have used these arguments during COVID, possibly. Unfortunately, people use these arguments for getting more benefits, which is a whole separate discussion. But it's not a completely ridiculous question as to what extent one can be economical with the truth. The problem is, truth is one of the midot of Hashem. Truth is one of the sort of, the hallmark of God is we talk about the God of truth and the Torah of truth. So one thing is for sure, it should be seen as what we call a b'diavad. It should be seen as less than ideal. So is the Torah telling us that you should use deceit and dishonesty to get what you want? I hope not. I'll give you some counter arguments, which might be very strong arguments as to why one should always tell the truth. Here we have Psalm 24. We say on Shabbos morning, right? Who can ascend the mountain of the Lord? The one who has clean hands and a pure heart. The one who didn't take my name in vain or sworn deceitfully. Right? A person who is completely whiter than white, if you could say that nowadays, has clean hands and a pure heart. Right? Surely that doesn't mean somebody who's stealing. Obviously, they don't have clean hands. What you wouldn't think someone who's stealing has clean hands, but maybe someone with clean hands includes someone who hasn't even given the slightest impression of dishonesty or impropriety. Right? We find it in the prophet Malachi. It says, the law of truth was in his mouth and unrighteousness was not found in his lips. Right? We find that in Eishes Chag as well, right? I think. No, that's the law of loving kindness. So Malachi there is speaking about a prophet, one who speaks in God's name, always has to have the law of truth. No unrighteousness found in his lips, has to be honest. right? And what do we say at the end of the meter? We say, guard my tongue from evil and my lips from misleading speech. So it seems like this is not the ideal at all. So why do we find so many examples of it in the Torah?
Yeah.
So what's the answer? So the answer is that the key to all this, of course, is why is Moshe asking for them to leave Egypt? Because they're slaves. So it goes without saying, in times of slavery, when you don't have freedom, then yes,
all of the examples we quoted before were all to ensure the continuity of the Jewish people.
That I would say is true, yeah, and you could include the birthright in that, definitely.
Yeah.
So where your very survival is at risk, where it's an existential threat, when you're not living in easy times, then yes, unfortunately, we do often find that one has to be a little bit circumspect about things. But maybe something to take to heart is that freedom goes with truth. Truth goes with freedom. So when you're living in times of freedom and plenty, there's no excuse for any kind of subterfuge or, funny business. At best, we can say, when we're living under duress, we often have to sometimes be less than honest with the truth, unfortunately. It should pain us, though. All these narratives, as you said, are basically about survival. Even the ones, the truth is, Shimon and Levi, what was their intention? Revenge. They probably also tell you they acted under duress. All the other examples. So if you're living in a society where you can't be fully honest, and you have to be dishonest to survive and to avoid oppression, then you're not living in an ideal society, which is true of all these things. So the hallmark of an ideal society would be one where absolute honesty is paramount. If we're not living in that society, where in order to survive, we genuinely have to unfortunately fudge things and create maybe a false impression, then that's clearly not an ideal society. And we don't live in an ideal society now. And throughout history, we've not lived in ideal societies. So freedom basically means truth. And lack of freedom often, unfortunately, means a surrendering of truth. So should you lie outright to avoid prosecution, let's say, for a crime you've done? No, you shouldn't. Are you allowed to create a false impression to advance the cause of basically Jewish continuity or survival? I mean, are we going to say that, you're not allowed to lie even if it means putting yourself at risk? It's important to be honest and truthful. Well, no, I think you are allowed to lie to protect yourself from harm. We see that. It's not a principle. It's a principle that's important. It's not a principle that is absolutely unequivocal. Whereas, for example, the taking of another life is, you're not allowed to take another life to save your own life. That's absolute. You're not allowed to murder someone. You're not allowed to serve idolatry or act and give up your religion, even if your life is at risk. You're not allowed to rape someone, even if your life is at risk, or to have an inappropriate relationship, but you would be allowed to lie. The interesting thing about the baptism certificate is it crosses over into the latter, because on the one hand, it's a piece of paper. On the other hand, it gives the impression that you've abandoned your religion. So it's an interesting one. And then the whole discussion about the Maranos. The word Marano has been replaced now, because it was considered quite offensive. A Marano means a pig. I've never quite worked out if they were called pigs by the Jews because they felt that they weren't sincere, or by the Christians because they felt they weren't sincere. But it's now been replaced with the word anusim or b'nei anusim. Anusim means those who were forced. They were forced to accept Christianity. So, but they kept Judaism in secret. So it's also a discussion, to what degree are you allowed to, if somebody said to you, if you don't tell me right now that, Jesus Christ was the Messiah, I'm going to stab you. Are you allowed to say it kind of tongue in cheek, like, because it's just ridiculous? Or is even that, where is the line? Are you allowed to mislead someone? But actually, if you recall, that's the famous story of Sanatoka from Rabbi Amnon of Mainz, right? That the bishop came to him and said, basically, if you don't convert, I'm going to cut off your limbs. And he said, come back to me, give me 3 days to think about it. And he was so distraught that he even gave the impression that he would even think about it. Then he put himself ultimately through great torture, and I believe, right, weren't all his limbs cut off, and he was brought into the shul on Yom Kippur, I think, and he said the prayer for Nisan and Tokef.
On the question of the Anusim, I think whatever you call them, Anusim or Moranos, throughout the centuries, they were always suspected by the church and by their Christian neighbors of secretly carrying on Jewish practices, which in many cases they were. So whatever you call them, it's whether it's pejorative or something neutral, it didn't matter. They were always that suspicion. When they were called conversos in every country, including this country, they were under suspicion.
So they made a decision to publicly at least pretend to convert, but in private they kept up their Judaism. There are stories to this very day of people who you know, I don't know, I'm probably oversimplifying it. I'm sure there's more that goes on, but of somebody who comes to the base and says, you know, my great-great-great-grandparents were Jewish and I'm trying to prove my Jewish status or whatever. They say, well, where are you from? Spain. So they'll say my grandmother always lit candles in a cupboard or in secret. You know, that was something that was passed down by those families. So why would you do that? You know, often that might have been proof that you were Jewish.
Even in my family, Rabbi, my mother, her father was the son of a Jewish woman,
right,
whose parents were both Jewish, and
right,
presumably Sephardi, actually. And my mother, although she wasn't Jewish, and my grandfather married out, my great-grandmother married out, even so, in the spring, I mean, I didn't know at the time anything about this, but in the spring, we always had matzahs.
Yeah.
We always bought matzahs in the spring.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know whether that was a hangover from her ancestors, that you have matzahs at Pesach, and whether it was at Pesach time, I don't know, or whether it was just that was the only time she saw matzahs in the shops. I don't know, but it makes me think, well, maybe it was a hangover.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Even that can be a little bit, and my grandfather, although he married out and his father was not Jewish, and he all his life he claimed to be an atheist, but when he was on his deathbed, apparently he asked them to get a rabbi for him.
Right. I mean, a derivative question from this is, unfortunately, there are many times you hear about people who only found out they were Jewish because on the deathbed, their parents, who were Holocaust survivors and didn't want the kids to know they were Jewish, told them on the deathbed, by the way, you're Jewish, you know, because...
Well, my mother didn't want me to know that she was partly Jewish.
Right.
My mother was horrified when I discovered that there was Jewish in the family.
Mm-hmm.
She was horrified, and in fact, she said the fact that because I said I'd been to I'd started going to the synagogue when I was in college, and she said, "Oh, it's the dirty Jewish blood in me," was her actual expression.
Wow. Amazing. So there you go. So, you know, this comes up in many different contexts. The one important point, I think, is that all these examples, we said, as Julian said, it's where there's an existential threat or there's an actual physical threat. But basically, it's not the norm. It shouldn't be the norm. The norm should be, as we see from the Psalms and from the prophets, to be completely upright and honest and beyond reproach. And don't say things that have double meanings and speak out both sides of your mouth and whatever, unless you have absolutely no choice. Right, here we go. Just stop the share and stop recording. Any questions?